Good morning, everyone. I appreciate you joining me for my regular updates from Washington. It's, again, been a bit of a busy week, and I think we've all were more than a little bit thrown for a loop by the leaking of what appears to be the Supreme Court's decision overturning Roe v. Wade. Let me, at the outset, say clearly, leaking a Supreme Court decision before it is official is wrong, and I think it is appropriate that the court should investigate and bring to justice whoever did this unprecedented leak. But I find it a little strange that so many of my colleagues here are not talking about the huge substance of what this decision implies. First of all, a decision that some of these justices basically said under oath during their hearings that they would respect legal precedent. And one of the reasons why I didn't vote for these justices that were part of this new conservative majority. But what we're really talking about here is taking away a basic right that women and Americans have enjoyed in this country for over 50 plus years. I think this will set a dangerous precedent. I think the full ramifications of the Alito decision, the harshness of that tone, if it ends up being the full decision, is pretty stunning to me. The idea that a 13-year-old young woman could be a victim of a rape and she would have no ability with her family, with her healthcare provider, with her religious advocate be able to have any decision or any choice about what happens going forward is pretty stunning to me. The idea that the Supreme Court would roll back these rights even in the case of rape and incest is frankly not where Virginians are or Americans are. I think Americans overwhelmingly want abortion to be safe, legal, and rare. And I think this Supreme Court decision will take away all of those rights. I think it will create a system where people will seek out abortions in unsafe circumstances the way it was back in the 1950s and the 1960s. Obviously, it will make abortion illegal in at least half states and many others. And I don't think it will by any means make abortion rare, but it'll simply drive abortions into the dark alleys of what was the status quo in the 50s and 60s. That's not where I think Americans are headed. I think elections matter. I again urge people to get out, and this is an issue of concern, vote this fall. And my fear is by the Supreme Court jumping feet first into these culture wars, that this woman's right to choose may just be the first step. Is the next step going to be rolling back any kind of rights women have to obtain contraceptive devices? Does it mean that gay rights or marriage equality will be the next battlegrounds where the Supreme Court rolls in? In our country, I think we've been generally about expanding rights, not constricting rights. And while I'm sure there'll be many more chapters to write in this story, and we'll be anxious to see if we can find who leaked this, which was wrong, but more importantly, if this ends up becoming the final decision, I think it has huge ramifications, obviously, well beyond the direct issue of the rights that have been protected by both the Griswold case around privacy and then the Roe v. Wade case. Back to the issues that we are grappling with right now on the floor of the Senate, and that is the bill that's had a half dozen names over the last year, the Endless Frontier USICA Competes Act, which I'm proud to be on the conference committee, but we desperately need to work out the final details and get it to the president's desk. This bill will make record investments in research and development, but particularly it will make sure that we continue to produce semiconductors, which are in every electronic device that has an on and off switch. And our lack of semiconductor supply chain right now is one of the reasons why it's so virtually impossible to buy a car, because there are literally hundreds of thousands of cars sitting, waiting to get to customers and consumers, but they don't have appropriate semiconductors. And our failure to have that drives up inflation. It robs jobs around this country. This will make a record $52 billion investment, this legislation, in semiconductor facilities here in America, build about 10 new ones in America, and I hope one of those will be in Virginia. It is very much a signal to the rest of the world that we're going to stand up against China's aggressive and oftentimes illegal actions in this area as they try to build up their own semiconductor facility and frankly flood the market, in many cases purchasing key equipment. And I don't want our country to be dependent upon a supply chain from China in terms of semiconductors. We've got to get this legislation resolved. We're right now going through the sausage making process of, it's a little bit frustrating about voting on motions to instruct the conference. I'll spare you the details other than the fact that most of these are political show votes and have no effect on the actual ending product that we hope to get to the president's desk. I hope before Memorial Day. It appears to be a little bit dragging at this point. It may put us into June. And I just point out, we came up with this legislation, and I was proud to be one of the original sponsors and drivers of this literally a year ago in July. Since that time, there have been great American companies like Intel that have announced new fabrication and new manufacturing plants in a state like Ohio. That plant will never be built if we don't pass this legislation. In the interim, even our allies like Germany have copied this procedure. And I talked to the CEO of Intel. They will receive close to $8 billion in subsidies from the German government. And that German plant will probably be built faster than the American plant because our inability in this country to go ahead and get what is broadly bipartisan to the president's desk. So we need to bring that conference to a conclusion and get this bill to the president's desk. Final comment I make before we get to questions is just the ongoing circumstances in Ukraine. I'm very proud of the fact that the American government, in concert again with our allies, is really stepping up and now getting the flow of arms to the Ukrainians in a rapid response, so that we're seeing the Ukrainian forces, particularly around the east, stand up to the Russian aggression. The long-range artillery will be some of the most valuable tools that we can get to the Ukrainians. And I'd point out that it's not only us, but many of our European allies are doing that as well. I do fear that we're into this war of attrition in Ukraine, and while the Ukrainians, I think, have an enormous will to fight, I'm not sure the Russians do, but I fear that Putin, who has been backed into a corner, and I initially had hoped that there might be some conclusion to this war by May 9th so that Putin could declare even a non-victory victory, but it appears now that this will grind on beyond May 9th, May 9th being key date because within Russia and the former Soviet Union history, that was the day where the Soviets defeated the Nazis in World War II, and there was some expectation that Putin may try to declare some level of victory, or my fear would be have a faux plebiscite where some of the areas in the east that the Russian forces have taken over, and that he could somehow try to absorb them into these rump republics that he's already declared independent. And I don't think the Ukrainian, at the end of the day, the Ukrainians will have to make the decisions about how to get to that negotiated settlement, but it's going to be a long and winding road. In the interim, though, the courage of the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian military, President Zelensky, has been remarkable. And we need to get this next $33 billion of assistance to Ukraine as quickly as possible. I would add one comment on that. And a little over half of that aid is military. And again, one of the things that's very important is our European allies are almost matching us, almost dollar for dollar, not quite in terms of getting aid. And I point out that things like NATO were basically almost destroyed by President Trump and his disdain for alliances. There are many things I'm critical of the current administration on. Rebuilding NATO and rebuilding that alliance is one where I think they've done extraordinarily well. A lot of that due to the good work from the intelligence community. But part of this additional assistance package will also be food and other kind of humanitarian assistance. And one of the things I'm working on in a bipartisan way is to make sure that the Jose Andres, who lives in the greater Washington capital region. Many of us in Northern Virginia are very familiar with him. He has an organization called World Central Kitchen. They have been the most effective food assistance deliverer in Ukraine. My hope is that we can actually build into this next relief package to make sure that American food aid that goes to Ukraine actually goes to those people on the ground distributing the most meals. And again, I think World Central Kitchen fits well into that category. And some of the places where we've given past food aid, for example, to the United Nations, who's been totally ineffective at delivering food aid, and frankly has been trying to be so so balanced that they almost feel like they got to feed a Russian for every Ukrainian, which is frankly rewarding the Russians for their aggression, is not the effective tool on distributing that aid. So wanted to add that. I think it's important that we reward those nonprofit entities who are actually on the ground delivering food to people in need. So with that, Laura, why don't I turn it over to you and let's go through the questions.
Our first question will be with Jim Spencer, The Daily Progress.
Senator, thanks for taking the call. You were talking about the Supreme Court going feet first into the culture war. What is sort of being dictated out of the Alito draft is something that smacks of Christian nationalism, and you had mentioned that maybe this next move would be to ban contraception and take away gay rights. Are you worried that the way the court is trending, and also maybe the country is trending, that we're headed toward this sort of theocratic approach to government?
Well, let me be clear, Jim. I have enormous respect for you, but I'm not accepting your characterization of these activities. But I am worried. I mean, you hear from some of my Republican friends, like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. I think Lisa Murkowski yesterday said, her confidence in the court, I'm paraphrasing here, has been hugely undermined. I mean, the Supreme Court, one of the reasons why it has been the kind of court of last resort is it's always been viewed as kind of beyond politics. And, listen, I think both political parties to a degree have tried to overly politicize their judicial nominees, although, frankly, new ground was broken when Leader McConnell basically didn't allow President Obama to even nominate a judge or even get a hearing. I think that undermines confidence in the court. And I am worried when potential Supreme Court justices come before the Senate and in their effort to try to get the job, get the votes to be confirmed, they say, well, we're going to stand by judicial precedent. And this has been a precedent that has lasted for longer than 50 years. And while I would not have liked it, I could have seen the court narrowing. Again, some of those rights, I wouldn't have agreed with it, but that would have, again, I thought, fallen within the lines that the Supreme Court operates. But the tone and tenor of the Alito decision, and let me be clear, it is only a draft decision. We'll see what comes out from the court in the summer. But I'll stick by my characterization that this is feet first into the culture wars, and I think it is an indication that women's health care may only be the first of what could be a line of attack against contraception, against gay rights, against marriage equality. It's got me gravely worried, and I think so many Virginians who I think, again, regardless of political affiliation, that's not where they want the court to head. That the only guarantee that we have with these kind of lifetime appointments is for people to get out and vote so that some of these rights can actually be enshrined in law.
Our next question will be Kelsey Childress with WSET. Kelsey?
Hi, it's actually Claire Galt with WSET. We switched. So I know you said the person who leaked this draft you believe was wrong. Do you think the person who leaked the draft should be prosecuted criminally, like the Republicans are saying?
I went to law school, but I never practiced a day of law. So I'm not going to weigh in on the legal ramifications. But if there was a law that was violated in this, whoever it is should be prosecuted. But I think it is. I find it a little bit like crocodile tears from some of my Republican colleagues who are spending all of their time bemoaning the leak. And listen, I'm against the leak. Whoever did this was wrong, whichever end of the political spectrum, whatever they were trying to force, this is not how our system works and there needs to be consequences. But the fact that they're not addressing the tone and tenor of this Alito decision that would yank back what has been legal precedent for more than 50 years, that would present the circumstance that I gave as an example of a 13-year-old young woman being raped and having potentially no recourse, no ability to have any decision with her family, her doctor, and whether it be her priest or minister or rabbi, to have any choices. I'd like to hear my colleagues address that issue. They can raise the concerns about the leak, but the question here is a dramatic rollback of women, and frankly, not just women, Americans' rights that have been in existence for more than 50 years. That notion of America always moving forward, I think is, grossly under assault in this decision, should it stand.
Moving on to Michael Martz with the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Yes, good morning, Senator. I'm interested in your thoughts of whether the Senate could possibly pass the legislation to enshrine Roe v. Wade in federal law. The House sent it to you last year. Obviously, you need 60 votes, and you probably don't have them at this moment, but Senator Murkowski, Senator Collins have both indicated that they feel a bit betrayed by the court. So I'd like your thoughts on that, and also the effect of this on the midterm elections in Virginia.
Well, Michael, I understand why Senator Collins, Senator Murkowski, feel, a bit betrayed. Somebody's applying for a job, and the job interview tells you they're going to do one thing, and then the first chance they get, they do the exact opposite. They have a right to have those concerns. Predicting how we would get to 60 votes, I think that's going to be a hard road to hoe in the Senate, under the current Senate. Even getting to 51, I'm not sure there are votes for changing the filibuster on this issue. So I think we will have a vote. The Virginia public, the American public, will be able to see how their senators voted on trying to enshrine the rights in Roe v. Wade and the privacy rights from Griswold into our law. And I'm frankly open to whatever is the simplest, most straightforward approach there. And if we can, make this approach that meets some of the needs of Senator Collins and Murkowski, I'm wide open to that. Because I think at the end of the day, it will be more a statement than something that's actually going to become law. And in terms of how it affects in the 2022 elections, I'm one of the worst political prognosticators around. I don't want to take away any of your guys' ability to make those predictions. But I will tell you this, I'm old enough to remember the election in 1989 when Doug Wilder was running for governor, and early on he was neck and neck, even a bit behind, and there was a Supreme Court decision that looked like it might not invalidate Roe v. Wade, but cut back on those rights. And in many ways, getting those suburban voters, mostly women, out to vote, it became a very motivating factor in 1989 in Doug Wilder's historic election as governor. Now, I know since that time, I think the general sense has been the Democrats or pro-choice folks have overly beat the drum, saying that the end of Roe v. Wade is near, and I think people have almost become oblivious to it a bit. I think the tone of this Alito decision and the breadth of it, I think it shocked a lot of people. I can just tell you from comments that I've heard, it's early on. Whether that will be the motivating factor, 90 days, 180 days from now, I hope so. But we also live in a time where we all know our folks' attention span on any issue seems to be fairly brief. I'm also hoping as well that you're going to see with the Fed actions today, and again, I don't want to predict here because you have the tape of me, it'll come back and bite me, but my sense is from everything I've been talking to economists and others is that we may be seeing at about this point the peak in inflation, and we may start to see it recede. Now, the price of that may be, as we've seen in the markets, a dramatic step back on the market's rise. But clearly inflation is still going to have a big effect on how people vote in the fall as well.
I just want to remind everyone to please mute your microphones before asking while asking a question. Moving on, we're going to go to Mike Gooding with 13 News now.
Hi there, Senator. Mike Gooding here. I have an unrelated Navy USS George Washington question. We heard from Vice Admiral Meyer yesterday at Airland, and he said, in fact, over the last 2 years, there have been 9 deaths among USS George Washington crew, and he believes 6 of them are suicide. I'm wondering, does this qualify now as a crisis as far as you're concerned?
Mike, this is a crisis. And I've been operating under a set of facts that thought it was closer to 7 and 8, and that some of these were, there was one unknown, but we know at least there were 4 suicides. So if the Admiral's saying it could be 6, it is a crisis. My office has reached out to the Navy. I've personally reached out to Carlos Del Toro, the Navy Secretary, who's a longtime friend of mine. I know that Congressman Scott and Congresswoman Luria were down visiting with the crew and the family. It's families of some of these sailors who've taken their lives. This is it is first and foremost a human tragedy. We do need a fulsome investigation. We do need to know. I know there was a command change before the George Washington went in for its refueling and retrofit, but it begs the bigger question of the number of living conditions of these sailors who are frankly living in a construction site. I don't know enough of the fact. We have to get the facts out whether that kind of living in the construction site led to this tragedy. I'm glad to see that the Navy has gotten about half of those sailors off the George Washington and into base housing, and they're on the process of getting the other sailors off. But I hope that the Navy will take this for the crisis as it is and put the full investigatory resources into how this happened, why this happened, and if we can, what we can do to stop these tragedies from happening in the future. We all owe a huge debt of gratitude to the sailors and their families who protect our nation. And figuring out how and why, and was this unique to the George Washington in any circumstances, or is this an even much larger issue across the Navy writ large, is something I think we're all committed to finding out.
Our next question will be Tom Rousey, ABC 7. Tom? Okay, we're going to move on to
Sorry,
Isabel.
I had myself on mute there.
Perfect.
Sorry. Senator, we just wanted to ask you about the CDC reiterating its guidance on masks yesterday, and if you feel they should still be doing that as guidance, if you feel they should keep fighting, having the Justice Department fight in court to try to get the right to do a mask mandate again. Just want to get your thoughts on the transportation mask mandate.
Tom, I'd never thought I'd rather, move from a CDC question back to political prognostication. But, I think we are all ready to move past the virus. I think the level of exhaustion with it is enormous. I saw data today that showed that the vast majority of Americans, even in the 70% plus, 80% plus, will still on their own choose to wear masks, in places like Metro or the airports. Unless there is a dramatic uptick in cases, the idea of reinstalling a mask mandate at this point, unless there is an overwhelming science or dramatic uptick in cases, I'm not sure, both in terms of the kind of civil fight that'll create amongst Americans, and frankly, the compliance rates at this point, even with a mandate, are somewhat at risk. So I think this, again, all subject to change if we see a dramatic surge again. We've got it driven by the science, but I think we've now moved into the domain where people are going to choose based upon their own feelings of personal safety, their own level of immunocompromise. I do hope at the end of the day we can learn from how we can be clearer on this. The only thing that I would point out is that I'm not sure what nation has got it right. We look at, and one of the things I'm concerned about when we look at a country like China that literally is going through a level of draconian shutdowns in Shanghai that I don't think Americans would ever agree to. But even that solution set is not fully working. So short answer is, Tom, I think the day of mandates, unless there's a dramatic shift in COVID uptake, are past us, and I think it's now going to be up to all of us making those personal choices on our own.
And we have time for one last question. It'll be Isabel Cleary with NBC 29.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for your time. Some political experts we spoke with said that after this week came out, it gives Democrats a big push going into the midterms here in Virginia. How much of a role do you think this week is going to play in campaigns, and why?
Well, Isabel, elections matter. The ability to protect women's rights. If the Supreme Court takes away those rights, it's left to Congress, it's left to state legislatures. But as I said earlier, I hope people will stay concerned, because I think the kind of culture war attack the Supreme Court's taking on goes well beyond women's health care choice rights. I think it could possibly extend the right to get contraception. I think it could bleed into gay rights and marriage equality. When the Supreme Court decides that it is going to weigh in as the ultimate arbiter, particularly a court where some of the justices in their application to be judges, have said one thing and then they get on the court and do something else, that undermines the long-term confidence in the court. And again, this could happen on either side of the political agenda. I think the notion that we ought to get the Supreme Court back to being that arbiter of last choice with people who are going to read and interpret the Constitution, not based on a political agenda. And I know people will say, well, the Democrats put up people too as well. I will grant you all that. I'd love to get back to judges where everybody has faith in them. I do think, if viewers feel like they don't like this direction of the Supreme Court, the only place where they can work to ensure that a woman's right to choose, for example, is protected, is to change the composition of the Congress and make sure that the composition of the legislature in Virginia protects those rights. Because as we've seen, even in states, and it's going to be very curious to see in some of the states I saw in Oklahoma recently, there was even the folks, 70 to 75% of folks in Oklahoma said they supported, abortion being safe, legal, and rare. Yet Oklahoma is passing an overwhelmingly restrictive ban through their state legislature. That can happen anywhere in America if this decision stands. So I hope people will build this into their consideration as they vote this fall.
Get in a few more questions. We're going to go to Mitchell Miller with WTOP.
Hi, Senator. Now, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Just a quick question related to Ukraine. as you know, you have a ton of things on the agenda for this month related to the Senate. Do you have any concerns that it could get bogged down, particularly at a time when we're talking about that May 9th date, which we'll have to see what happens there? But you have COVID, you have Republican concerns about immigration, and I just wonder what your thoughts are moving ahead on Ukraine aid.
Yeah. The vast majority of our elected members, Democrats, Republicans, support continued assistance to Ukraine. The vast majority of Americans, even though you've got the Tucker Carlson and his minions who continue to puppet Russian propaganda, which I find outrageous beyond belief. We need to get this done now. The $16 billion that we had passed earlier, there's still a little bit left in the pipeline on that aid. But this $33 billion, particularly to get that artillery, those shells, the other equipment, the helicopters to Ukraine, we need that. It does two things. One, it guarantees that the Europeans will continue to send as well. If we start to step back, the ability to keep the pressure on the Europeans to do their share will be undermined. And frankly, if you add up what we are sending in military aid plus what the Europeans are sending in military aid, you're getting close to $40 to $50 billion to Ukraine. The total Russian defense budget is only about $66 billion. So as Putin makes these calculations that Western assistance is going to rival in firepower the total Russian defense budget, my hope is that will give him pause. And if we don't act on this now, I know there are COVID issues, I know there are Title 42 issues, but we need to put our money where our mouth is in terms of supporting the bravery and courage of the Ukrainian people. To do anything otherwise would be irresponsible.
We're going to go to Joe Thomas with WCHV.
Thank you, Senator Warner. And I want to pivot to the Department of Homeland Security's Disinformation Board. And 2 points. Secretary Mayorkas said that, we're only going to be looking at international sources, but they've said that before about cell phone surveillance. So first, what is our guarantee that that's only going to be where they're looking for this? And given the head of this board's public statements on the Hunter Biden laptop being, quote, a fairy tale, which it turned out not to be, and the veracity of the now debunked Steele dossier, should you or have you spoken to Secretary Mayorkas about a different person to head this board should it continue?
Fair question, Joe. I have not spoken to Secretary Mayorkas yet. I have heard him publicly acknowledge that the rollout of this entity was bungled, and I can assure you. Let me tell you what I've got ability to oversee. I'm chairman of the Intelligence Committee. We have partial oversight of Department of Homeland Security, what is called their intelligence and analysis component. This is the group that frankly, we're trying desperately to get a permanent head in. We've got somebody who I think is a great nominee, Kenneth Weinstein, who was a longtime Republican. He was Bob Mueller's chief of staff. He was U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. He was George Bush's senior Homeland Security advisor. And unfortunately, we've got a fringe group on the Republican right who won't even let him get confirmed because the INA Department of DHS, this was the group that I think inappropriately sent people into the city of Portland when they had some of their disruptions. This was a group that is critically important, but I do think we need to have strict oversight on. DHS, by their nature, when you're looking at American information, can only look at foreign-based activity. What they can, the intelligence community component. What they can look, though, and this is again where getting it right. When you have, particularly when groups like Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and others, oftentimes even in concert or at least in communication with right-wing, often white nationalist paramilitary groups in Europe, that is appropriate oversight and overview. I do think the how we look at disinformation, misinformation is a subject of enormous importance. I spoke to a group this morning. The difference between now and 2016 and 2016, and I think our Senate intelligence investigation into Russian intervention, I still stand by that, and I think it is great bipartisan work. But what the Russians had to do in 2016 was they had to create fake American personas reinforced by technical bots to advance misinformation, disinformation into our election process. What the Russians now can do is they don't need to create the fake American personas because you have Americans, whether it is spewing disinformation about coronavirus vaccines, whether it is folks continuing the Trump big lie about a stolen election. All the Russians need to do now is amplify oftentimes the disinformation created by Americans. And Joe, we might just agree to disagree, but when some of those groups advocate the overthrow of our government, and as somebody who was on the floor of the Senate on January 6th, and I can guarantee you those intruders would have caused bodily harm to any member of the Congress, Democrat or Republican. They were out for blood. And you have political figures who are still defending that. And those kind of actions are, again, oftentimes reinforced by RT, Sputnik, and Russian means. But the source of that disinformation, misinformation, is actually coming from Americans. And if we have had appropriate oversight for these groups, whether they were kind of Ku Klux Klan groups or Antifa groups on the left or others for years, violent extremist groups. And the idea is simply now, because some of these groups have become more mainstream, that we're not going to look at that issue. That is not I think, a safe path for America. That all being said, how Mayorkas rolled out this group, I intend to have a conversation with him because it frankly has given fodder to folks that this is more than what it is meant to be. Sorry for the longer answer, but you always ask Joe a probing, tough question. I always wish you could have got you at the beginning of the line sometimes. So, Laura, do we have time for one? I know I got to go, but do we have time for one last one?
We've got one more question with Amy Knowles of Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for your time and thanks for taking our questions. Another important issue that continues to affect Virginians is the opioid crisis. And I know a few years ago, you and Senator Kaine worked together to pass the Support for Patients and Communities Act with massive bipartisan support. Now, next week is National Prevention Week, and I wondered if you could go over some of the positive aspects that you've seen come out of the Support Act since it passed.
Well, Amy, thank you for that question. And it was broadly bipartisan. My good friend Rob Portman, from Republican senator from Ohio, who unfortunately is retiring, was one of the guys we worked with closely. This puts money directly into communities where a lot of the challenge on trying to deal with opioids, and particularly as some of the opioids merge into particularly fentanyl, I think we've seen a dramatic decline in abuse of, prescriptions being written. That is the good news, and a lot of that has come from greater oversight at state level, local level, and federal level. But unfortunately, what it's driven, in many ways, it's driven, folks who are addicted to opioids into the black market, where they are buying, opioids on the black market too often that are laced with fentanyl. And that fentanyl becomes almost an immediate death warrant. I think we need to do more, particularly vis-a-vis China on this issue. That is the source of a lot of this fentanyl, to crack down. And this is obviously still a work in progress. I saw the film producer of Beth Macy's book, Dope Sick, the movie that's coming out shortly, that again tells the story of what happened not only in Southwest Virginia, but all across America. And unfortunately, Amy, I think while we have made some progress, this is not ever an issue that we're going to be able to say, okay, we've won, we've succeeded. We've seen this drug crisis morph into different forms over my whole lifetime. and I think there is more to be done. But I hope next week, as we come on this date, we both appreciate the actions that have been done, but also perhaps revitalize what the next steps in this agenda on cutting out the scourge of opioid and other addictions across our country.
And
all right.
that was our last.
Is that everybody, Laura?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much. Be safe, and on all the questions around the Supreme Court decision, time will tell. But I tell you, it does feel different to me. But again, we also live in a time, as we all know, where it feels like our attention spans have been narrowed a bit as well. Everybody be safe. Thank you all.